In 1847, a blood-stained confession letter discovered within the walls of a destroyed plantation home in Charleston County, South Carolina, was discovered. The murder of an enslaved woman called Patience and the subsequent systematic cover-up were described in the paper, which was written in two different handwritings. The identity of the second writer, a youngster under the age of 8, whose testimony ran counter to all official records, was what caused authorities to seal the case file for 70 years, in addition to the brutality detailed. Citing issues of public repute, the Charleston Historical Society did not address the letter's legitimacy until 1923. This evening, we disclose what that young girl observed on August 14, 1834, in the barn, and the reason the truth was interred more deeply than any grave. I need you to accomplish something before we move on to the Magnolia Ridge Plantation narrative. Stories like this, the ones they attempted to obliterate from history, must be told. So click that subscribe button immediately. Additionally, let me know in a comment which state or city you are listening from. Where is my audience learning about these troubling periods in American history? The Rutland family's private files were released to the state archives only when the last surviving descendant passed away without leaving any successors, which is when the materials we're going to talk about were declassified. Magnolia Ridge was located 12 miles inland from Charleston, close enough to the port to allow for profitable exports, but far enough away from the coastal humidity to allow for respectable tobacco growth. It was one of 43 plantations in the county in 1834, neither the biggest nor the smallest, with 400 acres and 62 slaves. The 1809 manor house had white paint that burned in the unrelenting sun, the trendy Greek revival columns that every aspiring planter desired, and a reputation for steadiness that made it unremarkable in comparison to its contemporaries. In 1828, at the age of 31, Samuel Rutledge acquired the property from his father. In contrast to some of Samuel liked the routine of managing an agricultural property better than the more flashy planters who spent seasons in Charleston society. He bought high-quality breeding stock, maintained what he called acceptable discipline among his employees, and kept careful records. In 1830, his widowed sister Margaret moved into the estate, leaving Samuel to raise their lone son Thomas when his wife Catherine passed after giving birth to him. The plantation was run according to the established hierarchy of the period. The field workers were supervised by Dutch Calloway, an overseer who was brought in from Georgia in 1832, a pair of domestic helpers. Elderly women named Bess, and cleaning and cooking were done by Clara, with the overseers Belle and the unrelenting South Carolina sun serving as their yardsticks. The others toiled in the tobacco fields. Drummond, a 26-year-old patient who was born on the site, was one of those 62 people. According to the records, she was a competent field hand with no documented issues. However, those who knew her recalled something else, a haunting, clear singing voice that reverberated throughout the fields during harvest. Her daughter Ruby was born in 1826, but the plantation records didn't contain her father's name. This wasn't uncommon. There were a lot of these silences in those pages. Beginning at age 6, Ruby worked at the manor house, learning simple domestic skills under Bess's guidance. Small for her age, she was quiet, had her mother's dark eyes, and had a tendency to watch things with an intensity that some found unsettling. Her transfer from fieldwork had been approved by Samuel Rutledge, who noted in his ledger that the girl demonstrates aptitude for domestic work and could be useful in that role. Especially cruel was the summer of 1834. In July, temperatures rose above 95 degrees for 18 days in a row, and the plantation doctor diagnosed heat apoplexy as the cause of death for 2 senior field laborers. Dutch Calloway became more irritated, lengthening work hours and decreasing water breaks, and the tobacco crop suffered from prematurely yellowing leaves. Similar to the heat waves emerging from the red clay, tensions simmered across Magnolia Ridge. While his father went over accounts in the study, 8-year-old Thomas Rutledge spent his days in the great home studying Latin and mathematics with a tutor brought in from Charleston. The youngster was already displaying the traits of the severe planter he was being raised to be. He had his father's grave manner and his mother's fair complexion. Ruby frequently saw him while on duty. This additional child, whose world was physically close to hers but still seemed unachievably far away. The 38-year-old Margaret Rutledge was a strict and efficient manager of the household. She had never been married, and rumors circulated that she had been engaged once when she was younger, but she never mentioned it. Rather, She focused her efforts on transforming Magnolia Ridge into a paragon of southern domesticity, at least inside the estate. Keeping the cool courtesy required by Charleston society, she examined Ruby's work critically, making corrections to the folding of linens and the positioning of silverware without ever raising her voice. The manor house, a large building that housed workhorses, was 200 yards behind the barn where everything would take place. Equipment and acted as a place to keep seeds and tools. Hay and other supplies were stored in the loft, which was reachable by ladder and was constructed of pine planks over oak framing. In one area, Dutch Calloway kept a modest office consisting of a desk and chair, where he stored his documents and, based on later testimony, a bottle of whiskey concealed in a barrel of grain. After field labor concluded in August, patients were tasked with nightly barn duties which included watering and feeding the horses. Although Samuel Rutledge's ledgers only noted reassignment because of falling field output, some conjectured that this was a gesture of goodwill from him because it was less labor-intensive than picking tobacco. She would get there at sunset, spend an hour with the animals, and then head back to the slave quarters, which are a row of tiny cabins that can be seen from the second-story windows of the manor. Magnolia Ridge life mirrored the trends that had been set in the South for decades. A meticulously upheld hierarchy in which each person was aware of their position and the repercussions of ignoring it. The punishments were severe but not out of the ordinary by 1834 norms, and the labor was rigorous but predictable. Though not as soft as some of his neighbors, Samuel Rutledge thought of himself as a sensible man. He paid his debts, went to church on Sundays, and demanded the same level of order from his family that he did in his ledgers. There was no indication in those meticulously defined columns that the barn floor would be stained with blood in a matter of days. There was no indication in the quiet routine of nighttime prayers and morning bells that a youngster would see anything that would haunt her for 70 years. According to the paperwork, Ruby was meant to be sleeping that night in the house servants' quarters. Rather, she had gone in search of her mother. At Magnolia Ridge, August 14, 1834, started off like any other Thursday. The sunrise occurred at 5:47 a.m., and 15 minutes later, Dutch Calloway's bell rung, calling the field laborers out of their cabins. Patience. In the direction of the tobacco fields, Drummond joined the line. As Bess required dough for the morning's biscuits, her daughter watched from the kitchen window of Manor House. Already, the temperature was rising toward another sweltering day. Ruby's tasks for the morning were to beat dust off the parlor rugs, polish the dining room silver, and assist Bess with breakfast service. Her mind elsewhere, she carried out these tasks in a mechanical manner. She had heard Dutch Calloway tell Samuel Rutledge the previous evening that Patience had been neglecting her evening responsibilities by leaving the barn before everything was finished. Ruby had witnessed her mother's weariness, holding her side as though something ached there. She had been moving more slowly lately. As the day went on, the heat became unbearable. The plantation doctor had to be called in from his rounds at a nearby property by the afternoon, because 3 more field laborers had fallen. Samuel Rutledge took his time studying, weighing the value of potentially harmed workers against the cost of lost labor. To compensate for missed time, Dutch Calloway announced that he was adding 1 hour to the workday. Silent fear echoed through the slave quarters as the decision was made. At 7:30 p.m., Patience came back from the fields. Sweat soaked through her dress and her bare feet were covered in red clay. She was dusting the banisters on the second-story landing when moving in the direction of the barn. Ruby was concerned because of something in Patience's posture, a heaviness that went beyond physical fatigue. Several sources, including the confession letter, testimony provided 30 years later, and tangible evidence recorded when the barn was eventually inspected in 1847, tell us what transpired next. Although the testimonies don't always line up exactly, some facts are undeniable. Right at 8:15 p.m., Ruby completed her tasks and was sent to the servants' quarters to sleep as dusk descended over Magnolia Ridge. Rather, motivated by anxiety she was unable to adequately describe, she turned back toward the barn. The cicadas were starting their evening chorus, and the sky had taken on that special purple-gray of southern twilight. As imprisoned children began to move, she moved in stealthily, becoming little and inconspicuous. The main door of the barn was half open, and light from the lamps poured in. 2 voices were audible to her. One was her mother's, begging, and the other made her stomach knot in terror. Ruby slithered to the side of the barn where glimpses of light were visible through the spaces between the boards. 40 years later, she would write about what she witnessed, when her fingers were twisted by arthritis. Yet her memory remained intact. Patients were positioned close to the wall-backed horse stalls inside the barn. Dutch Calloway blocked the entrance and faced her. The alcohol bottle was on display on his makeshift desk as he fumbled his words. He was discussing her rudeness, imparting knowledge and topics Ruby was too young to completely comprehend, but old enough to be afraid. Using the delicate differential tone required for survival, Patience was attempting to talk her way out. "I completed everything, sir, Mr. Calloway. The task you requested. The horses are watered and fed. The stalls are messed up, just the way you wanted it. Are you asking me a question?" He raised his voice. "Are you accusing me of lying? No, sir. That's not what I'm saying." The initial punch was delivered quickly, and his fist struck the patient's jaw with a Ruby would spend the rest of her life hearing this sound in her dreams. Calloway struck her mother once more, this time in the ribs as she stumbled and attempted to steady herself on the stall door. Ruby's childlike mentality begged her to run, to seek assistance, to do action, but she remained motionless. Unable to turn aside or move ahead, tiny fingers clutched the rough barn wood. She witnessed Calloway kick her once and twice, saw her mother fall, and saw Patience attempt to shield themselves by curling up inside of her. Then came the turning point that would determine the rest of the story. The doorway of the barn opened and Samuel Rutledge emerged. For a single crystallized moment, Ruby believed that salvation had come. This would be stopped by the master. He would keep her mom safe. Wasn't it what the meticulously preserved fiction of paternalistic plantation management promised? Even though they were severe and protective of their property, masters were ruthless but fair. For maybe 5 seconds, Samuel Rutledge stood in that doorway, absorbing the image. His enslaved worker was bleeding on the barn floor, and his overseer was furious and intoxicated. The comments from his niece's meal reverberated across the room. "Uncle, you're too gentle with them. As my father used to say, order is maintained by discipline." Ruby didn't see rage at Calloway in his face. It was a calculation. You were attacked by her. It wasn't a question, according to Samuel Rutledge. It was a directive. Dutch Calloway, who was panting heavily, appeared to comprehend right away. "Indeed, sir," brought a pitchfork at me. I had to defend myself. With blood dripping from her lips, Patience attempted to speak. "No, please, Master Samuel. I never do." However, Samuel Rutledge had already made up his mind and turned away. "Mr. Calloway, do whatever it takes to get everything back in order. I'll let the housekeeping crew know that something happened. A sad event." His boots crunched on the gravel road as he left the barn and made his way back to the manor house. When Dutch Calloway glanced down at Patience, his demeanor changed. He no longer had to control himself. With the master's tacit approval, Ruby witnessed the death of her mother. The specifics are too graphic to describe in detail, and Ruby, the 8-year-old child who wrote the second confession letter, found it difficult to express what she had seen. The sounds she described included the wet crack of something breaking inside, the barn cats running away from the bloody smell, and her mother's singing voice reduced to gasping whimpers. She described being terrified and knowing that yelling might result in her own death, which paralyzed her. Dutch Calloway was standing over her when it was all over, and Drummond's body was motionless in the blood-soaked straw. He inhaled deeply and drank his whiskey bottle slowly. Then he turned to face the opening in the barn wall where Ruby had pressed her eye. "I see you, girl." Ruby took off running. She fled toward the only haven an 8-year-old enslaved kid could envision, past the well where her mother had taken her final sip of water, past the slave quarters where people had learned not to hear screaming, and through the darkening plantation grounds, the large home where Master Thomas slept, where Aunt Margaret kept things in order and where someone would undoubtedly lend a hand. Bess was banked the flames for the night when she staggered through the kitchen door. Ruby rushed in, covered in barn dust and fear, and the old woman's face went white. "What, kid? My mother was murdered by Master in the barn." The words poured forth, the truth untainted by survival instinct or strategy. Master Samuel was present, and he instructed Mr. Calloway to do it. My mother had passed away by the time he noticed me observing, and Bess's hand closed over Ruby's lips, stopping the stream of words. The two of them stood motionless for a moment in the lingering heat of the kitchen. The elderly woman's terrified eyes reflected Ruby's own. "You listen to me," Bess said in a tremulous murmur. "You don't say them words again, you hear me?" But it was too late. Not if you want to live to see morning." Samuel Rutledge stood in the kitchen doorway with Margaret at his side, both of them having listened to everything that was said. Curious about the disturbance, Thomas, wearing a nightshirt, looked around his aunt's skirts. More terrible than any scream was the silence that ensued. The expression on Samuel Rutledge's face, which he wore as he reviewed accounts or calculated crop yields, was unreadable. He was solving a problem. Ruby understood with a clear sense of utter fear. She was an issue that needed to be resolved. He finally said, "The child is hysterical," speaking to Margaret, who had been shocked by her mother's accident in the barn, her resistance to discipline, and the tragic outcome. The overseer was protecting himself from an attack which was tragic but necessary. The girl, however, looked at Ruby with cold, merciless eyes, and he made dangerous accusations. He turned to Bess and said, "Take her down. Don't let her speak to anyone." As Bess's shaking hands dragged Ruby toward the cellar stairs. "What are you suggesting, Samuel?" She saw nothing. She understands nothing. She'll be locked in the cellar tonight while we determine what's to be done. She finally let out the sound that had been stuck in her throat since witnessing her mother's murder. She screamed her mother's name, the truth and accusations that would have resulted in the immediate death of any adult enslaved person. Thomas Rutledge, who was 8 years old and shielded from the harsh realities of the plantation, asked the question that would haunt him for decades. "Aunt Margaret, why is Ruby crying?" "Where is her mama?" Margaret's answer was interrupted when Bess pulled Ruby down into the cellar, a stone-walled room that smelled of potatoes and earth, where the child's cries would be muffled by thick walls and the deliberate deafness of all those who heard them. Above in the barn, Dutch Calloway was clearing away the evidence of what he would always say was self-defense against a violent enslaved woman. The pitchfork he placed close to the patient's body had never been touched by her hands. The marks he carefully inflicted on his own face would support his story. And in his study, Samuel Rutledge dipped his pen in ink and started recording the official account in his plantation ledger. August 14, 1834. Enslaved woman patient Drummond, age 26, was killed while attacking overseer Dutch Calloway with a farming implement. The use of force was required to subdue the aggressor. Ruby, the 8-year-old daughter, saw the aftermath and became hysterical. The matter was settled in accordance with the law. There was a total loss of property. One field hand was worth $600. Samuel Rutledge believed that the numbers were accurate. They were neat and orderly, free from the messy complications of truth. In the cellar, the old woman's hands trembled as she sat down the meager breakfast. "Child, you listen carefully now," Bess whispered, looking anxiously toward the cellar stairs. "Master Samuels called for the magistrate, saying that there needs to be an official inquiry into what happened." Ruby Drummond huddled in the darkness, understanding with the terrible wisdom of traumatized children that she had just learned what her life was worth. Morning light filtered weakly through the cellar's single high window when Bess returned with a piece of cornbread and a tin cup of water. Bess's voice cracked. "You're 8 years old and enslaved. The judge won't believe anything you say against a white overseer." Dutch Calloway Dunn gave his version already. "He claims that your mother tried to kill him, and that he defended himself. He claims that you haven't seen anything but the aftermath, that you're making up stories because you're grieving. But I saw it. She didn't need to finish the sentence because Master Samuel was there." Judge Edmund Pritchard, the magistrate, arrived at 10 Ward that morning in his carriage, riding up Oakline Drive. He was 56 years old, had presided over Charleston County for 18 years, owned a small plantation of his own 20 miles south, and was a member of the same gentleman's club in Charleston as Samuel Rutledge. The inquiry, as it was called, took place in Samuel Rutledge's study. The first to give his account was Dutch Calloway, who stood with his hat in his hands, his face displaying the scratches he had caused to himself the previous evening, and described the patient's impolite behavior, her refusal to finish tasks, and when he confronted her about her disobedience, her violent attack with a pitchfork. "I feared for my life, Your Honor," Calloway said steadily. "She came at me like a wild animal. I was forced to protect myself. It is a true tragedy, but a man is entitled to self-defense." In a leather-bound binder, Judge Pritchard took notes. "Did anyone see this assault happen?" When it was finished, Ruby, the girl, arrived at the barn. She is a child who discovered her mother dead and alive, unable to comprehend what transpired. Been making up stories and saying things that aren't true. I think it's grief talking. Carefully leaving out his own presence in the barn, Samuel Rutledge confirmed the overseer's chronology. After hearing a disturbance, I looked inside it and saw the woman dead, and Calloway shaken but unharmed. According to Mr. Calloway, the girl was upset and made unfounded claims. Samuel paused before continuing. "And these accusations are," he said. "She says I was there and in some way complicit in the incident. Nothing more than a traumatized child's ravings. At the time an issue, I was analyzing accounts for my study. My sister can confirm this. When called to testify, Margaret Rutland verified her brother's alibi without looking Judge Pritchard in the eye. Yes, Samuel was in his study. At Untold, I gave him tea and noticed that he was working there. Before the girl ran into the house and screamed about her mother, I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary." The judge shut his notebook. "I don't see the need to look into this anymore. A terrible instance of using appropriate force in the face of aggressive opposition. In his capacity as overseer, Mr. Calloway acted legally. Although tragic, the enslaved woman's death seems to have been legal." He gave Samuel a look. "The girl will need to be managed carefully. Such accusations, even from a child, can be problematic. She'll be dealt with appropriately," Samuel reassured him. Ruby, who remained confined to the cellar, was never asked to testify. Her remarks have no bearing on South Carolina's 1834 legal system, weight, no legitimacy, and no ability to challenge the meticulously crafted story. But the previous night, someone else had heard her screaming. The 8-year-old Magnolia Ridge heir, Thomas Rutledge, could not forget Ruby's voice as she cried out her charges. The boy had grown up believing that the social structure of plantation life was natural and predetermined by God, yet something about Ruby's fear had greatly unsettled him. He had seen her almost every day of his life, and she was almost his own age. But now she was imprisoned in the cellar like a criminal. Thomas sneaked down to the cellar that afternoon, while his aunt oversaw the preparation of patients' bodies for burial in the slave cemetery, and his father met with Judge Pritchard. With her dusty face covered in dried tears, Ruby crouched in the corner, clutching her knees. Lamplight came before the boy came downstairs, and she looked up, and they just stared at each other for a while. Two kids split up by all that their society deemed unchangeable. With a voice almost audible above a whisper, Thomas questioned, "Did you really see what happened?" Ruby's immediate reaction was to say anything would keep her alive, to deny everything, to repent. However, something snapped inside her when she saw Thomas's face, which was so like her own in its innocence and bewilderment. She was honest with him. Dutch Calloway's violence, her mother's demands, and most damning of all, Samuel Rutledge's decision at the barn doorway. Thomas heard with increasing terror. Father, however, refused. "He frequently asserts that we have an obligation to treat our people fairly," Ruby added. "Your father watched my mama die," in a hollow voice. Then he turned to leave. The boy's expression turned pallid. To protest, to stand up for his father, he opened his mouth. However, a part of him that had not yet been completely shaped by the system he would inherit was able to identify truth when he heard it. Thus, the words would not come. He finally replied, "I have to go," and retreated toward the stairs. Ruby called after him, "If they catch me here, Master Thomas," even as she asked for his assistance, using the title that furthered their distance from one another. "Please don't let them sell me. They're going to do it, please." Ruby's request tormented Thomas, who ran up the stairs without responding. He did something that evening that would ultimately result in the confession letters being found 113 years later. He started recording everything he heard and saw in a covert journal, the handwriting of his child, recording facts that the official records would obliterate. The following day, Drummond was laid to rest in the slave cemetery in an unmarked grave. Beyond the tobacco fields, a piece of land where the slaves on the property slept without a ceremony or headstone. The funeral went quickly. Although Samuel Rutledge was not present, he did record in his ledger the cost of the lost work time. 3 more days passed while Ruby waited for her fate to be determined in the cellar. In order to deal with a youngster in slavery who had seen something she shouldn't have and, worse, had talked about it, Samuel Rutledge conferred with other planters. It was a concerning unanimity. A witness like that was risky. The meticulously preserved order is threatened by her own existence. A number of possibilities were discussed. Selling her would only shift the issue to another location, and her narrative may become well known. In addition to silencing her, severe punishment can turn her into a martyr in the eyes of the other enslaved laborers. The planters agreed that what was required was a solution that would be both practical and uphold the appearance of benign paternalism. The answer came from Margaret Rutledge. On the fourth day that Ruby had been imprisoned, Margaret came down the cellar stairs with a washbowl and a clean dress. She took them to their seats and looked at the youngster with a look that was neither kindly nor unkind, just practical. "You'll be staying in the house permanently now," Margaret declared. Ruby remained silent, realizing that no answer was anticipated. "You'll have a small room off the kitchen, better than the quarters. Your duties will increase, but so will your privileges. Better food, warmer shelter, but there are conditions. What you believe you witnessed in that barn will never be discussed. Not to anyone, not to visiting guests, not to the other servants. No. You will die within a year if you do, and you will be sold to a plantation in Georgia where they cultivate rice fields and swamps filled with snakes. You get it?" "Indeed, ma'am," Margaret went on, her voice lowering. "More than that. You will actively back the official account of what happened. If someone asks you how you got there after the tragedy, you'll say that you spotted your mother's body and thought something wasn't right. You were crazy because of your pain. Now you know that Mr. Calloway was acting to protect himself. Are you able to say that?" Ruby's lips became parched. She would have to participate in her mother's murder in order to live, would have to use language that compromised the patient's recollections. However, what options did an 8-year-old child under slavery have? "That's what I can say," she muttered. "All right, then we have mutual understanding." As she turned to go, Margaret stopped at the stairs. "The death of your mother was regrettable, but there must be order. You are smart enough to realize that. Ruby, I believe that intelligence may either be a blessing or a curse. It is up to you to decide what it becomes." Ruby was placed in a room off the kitchen that was maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, just big enough for a narrow bed and a little trunk for her things, but it had a window that opened and a door that closed, and most importantly, it was in the main house and directly supervised by Margaret Rutledge. Ruby would be under continual observation, with every word she spoke and every action she took being closely examined. The routines of Magnolia Ridge life resumed. They harvested the tobacco. Dutch Calloway remained overseer, his power unquestioned. According to Judge Pritchard's official report, the case was concluded, and 8-year-old orphan Ruby Drummond learned to play her new part as the appreciative slave girl who had been granted forgiveness following unfounded charges brought on by sorrow. However, Ruby would put her ear to the wall in that tiny chamber off the kitchen late at night to hear the house settling and the sound of Margaret's footsteps above. To the voice of Samuel Rutledge talking to guests on business, she listened and recalled, committing all the information to a memory that would outlast the official documents. Thomas Rutledge continued to write in his hidden notebook in his second-floor chamber, in a child's hand, about the night Ruby came screaming into the home, the narrative she had told him in the cellar, and the doubt that had grown within of him about his father's character. Unaware that they were recording the truth that grown-ups had labored so hard to conceal, the two kids were divided by the wide disparity of their situations. It would take years for their written words to come together in that letter of confession. Before anyone read what they had recorded, decades would pass. However, once the truth is seen, it can never be completely eradicated. It just waits. In the months after Patient's passing, Magnolia Ridge was enveloped in a tense hush. It was the quiet of carefully hidden secrets, of questions purposefully left unsaid, of a community that had come to an agreement to ignore unpleasant realities. Dutch Calloway became more assertive in his command. The overseer no longer felt the need for restraint, as Samuel Rutledge had implicitly approved of his behavior. His brutality against the enslaved laborers he controlled escalated along with his drinking. 3 additional people had perished by December 1834 for reasons that the slave quarters interpreted differently, but which were formally assigned to accidents or natural causes. One of the older housekeepers, Clara Ara, was finding it harder and harder to remain silent about what she felt. She'd known the woman for years, had raised Ruby, and knew that the official version didn't match the patients she'd known, even if she hadn't seen any patients die. Clara talked carefully one afternoon while she was making dinner in the kitchen with just Bess and Ruby there. Not taking her eyes from the potatoes she was peeling, she told Ruby, "That pitchfork they said your mother had seized. The left hand was used by Patience. Everyone was aware of that. However, the pitchfork was discovered on her right side. It's funny that Ruby remained silent despite being 9 years old and hardened by months of being forced to keep quiet. However, she tucked the detail aside, adding it to the list of inconsistencies she was mentally making." Bess gave Clara a stern glance. "It's not for us to wonder what went wrong. The judge ruled that it was legal. Clara Ara remarked, "Judge said a lot of things that don't add up." However, when she heard Margaret Rutledge's footsteps in the corridor, she stopped talking. It was an especially hard winter. The rare snowfall in Charleston was seen negatively by the residents. Because of the bad tobacco crop, Samuel Rutledge's financial condition became unstable. He left his sister and Dutch Calloway to run the plantation on a daily basis while spending more and more time in Charleston, attending meetings with creditors and possible investors. In February 1835, during one of these absences, an incident occurred that would eventually be crucial in revealing the entire extent of what had transpired. A tourist named Jacob Winters showed up at Magnolia Ridge on August 14th. He claimed to be a Boston-based journalist covering Southern agriculture techniques. Following the customs of Southern hospitality, Margaret Rutledge invited him to remain for dinner in the night. She was unaware that Winters was actually involved with the nascent abolitionist movement and had traveled under false pretenses to record the conditions on plantations in the South. That night, 9-year-old Thomas Rutledge was permitted to eat dinner with the grown-ups. As enslaved servants were taught to be invisible, Ruby served at the table. However, she was constantly listening. She also gained something from what she heard that evening that she had not had since her mother passed away. I hope. Winters was eloquent in his discussion of moral philosophy, human dignity, and justice. His implications were obvious to anybody listening, but he was cautious not to openly denounce slavery, since he knew that doing so would result in his expulsion from the house. While taking a second helping of sweet potatoes from Ruby's plate, Winters remarked, "I've heard disturbing accounts of incidents on plantations being covered up by local authorities. When there is proof to the contrary, deaths are declared accidental. The system appears to defend itself, doesn't it?" Margaret had a chilly smile. Such incidents undoubtedly happen on properties that are not properly maintained. At Magnolia Ridge, we treat our residents with respect and uphold appropriate order. When necessary, use discipline but never be unkind. I'm glad to hear that. But I am aware that there was a terrible event here not too long ago. Your overseer killed an enslaved woman. The dining room's temperature appeared to plummet. Margaret placed her fork down with purposeful accuracy. A self-defense case that the magistrate thoroughly examined and decided. The woman used a farming tool to attack Mr. Calloway. Winters remarked, "How terrible for all involved." But his gaze had already gone to Ruby, who was standing still beside the sideboard. Was there any compensation given to the woman's family? Paid? Margaret's brows went up. "I believe you may have been in Boston too long, Mr. Winters. She was someone's property. Instead of compensating family members who are property, one compensates the owner for the loss of their property. Naturally, I occasionally forget the relevant legal distinctions." Thomas was the focus of his attention. "And do you like living on the island, young man? And do you like living on the island, young man?" Plantation? After being quiet during the lunch, Thomas found it difficult to respond. He had grown more and more worried by the discrepancies between what he had seen and what he had been taught about good Southern values in the months since Ruby's stunning confession. His father would have been appalled by the remarks in his 50-page hidden journal. "It's all I've known, sir," Thomas said at last. The thoughtful response of a youngster who had discovered that being honest could be harmful. Winters took a moment to talk to Ruby alone in the hallway after supper, while she was washing the dishes. What he said, we spoke quickly, hardly more than a whisper. Ruby's hands gripped the serving platter when she said, "The woman who died, she was your mother, wasn't she?" She looked around anxiously, knowing that she may be punished if she was seen talking to a guest. She saw something in his eyes and responded, "Yes, sir." "Did it happen the way they said?" Sincere care and an openness to the truth. For a while, she wanted to open up to someone who might genuinely care, so she was tempted to tell him everything. However, survival instincts developed during 6 months of forced silence won out. "As they said, sir, that happened. That day my mother wasn't herself. Perhaps the heat. Mr. Calloway had to defend himself when she made a stupid mistake. I really miss her, but I now realize that it was her fault and no one else's. In her mouth the words tasted like ash, but the words that kept her alive were those." Winters examined her face and could see that her answer had been prepared. "I understand. Well, there are many in Charleston who would listen if you ever needed to tell a different story. Quakers are the members of the Society of Friends. On King Street they have a meeting house. They occasionally assist people." Margaret Rutledge entered the hall before Ruby could answer. "Bring those plates to the kitchen, Ruby. Maybe you'd like a brandy in the parlor, Mr. Winters." The seed had been sown, but the moment was past. Some people could believe her and provide assistance. The information was both sustaining and dangerous. During breakfast the following morning, Winters slipped a little card into Thomas's palm before departing. Thomas concealed the card in his journal. It bore the words, "Truth matters even when it's dangerous," and an address in Charleston. And another secret to the expanding collection. As spring approached, Magnolia Ridge underwent changes that would initiate the events that resulted in the creation of the confession letters. Samuel Rutledge's financial difficulties grew worse. He was compelled to think about selling some of his enslaved workers due to the bad tobacco harvest the year before, declining prices, and growing debt. As families faced the possibility of being split up, the idea frightened everyone in the slave quarters. Vernon Tisdale, a Georgia cotton trader, came to the plantation in April 1835 to determine which employees may be sold. Known for buying enslaved people in large quantities and sending them to the growing cotton plantations in the Deep South, where mortality rates were far greater than in the Upper South, he was a hard man with calculating eyes. Tisdale was shown around the quarters by Dutch Calloway, who treated the employees like cattle being put up for sale. Ruby observed from the kitchen window as men and women were inspected, their value determined, their muscles evaluated, and their teeth scrutinized. The overseer was obviously enjoying his job, offering suggestions based on temperament and production. As they got closer to the house, Margaret summoned Ruby into the parlor where Tisdale and Samuel Rutledge were going over some paperwork. "This is Ruby," stated Samuel. "Obedient and quiet, this housekeeper has been trained since childhood and is literate enough to understand simple instructions." Tisdale made a careful circle around Ruby while conducting his clinical and degrading evaluation. "What is your age?" 9 years. Ideal age for receiving instruction in increasingly difficult domestic tasks. "Any behavioral or health concerns?" When Samuel paused, Ruby realized that a decision was being made about her future. Last year there was an incident. Her mom passed away, and in her sadness the youngster made some unwarranted charges, but she has since been rectified and has not caused any problems. Tisdale became more interested. "What sort of charges?" "Nothing significant. A child's interpretation of what happened. She now knows better. When they get older, kids who accuse others can cause trouble," Tisdale thought. "Recollections can be harmful. A well-trained housekeeper, however, is a tremendous asset." Samuel's face lit up with relief as he mentioned a price. The floor tilted under Ruby's feet. They were selling her, following months of coerced cooperation and lying to keep her alive. In any case, she was being transferred to Georgia, where she would probably perish in cotton fields before she could become an adult. Ruby made a choice that evening that would change the trajectory of many lives. She would bolt. Plantation escape attempts from South Carolina were rather frequent, but their success rates were low. With swamps, rivers, and hundreds of miles dividing the slave and free states, the topography worked against fugitives. Ruby, however, had nothing left to lose, was 9 years old, and was desperate. She recalled what Jacob Winters had said about the Quakers on Charleston's King Street. Maybe there was hope if she could make it to the city. Thomas Rutledge was the only person she told about her intentions. The risk was calculated. She had noticed Thomas's increasing unease with his father's behavior over the past few months, even though he might easily betray her. The boy battled doubt, wrote in his journal nonstop, and asked questions that adults found awkward. Ruby had the impression that he might still be able to put morality ahead of expediency. One afternoon she discovered him in the library, writing in his journal while ostensibly studying Latin. "I have something to tell you, Master Thomas." Startled, he raised his head. They hardly ever had direct conversations, no longer. The events of the past year have further widened the gap between their worlds. "What is it? That dude from Georgia is buying me. Tonight I'm going for a run." Thomas's expression turned pallid. "You can't, Ruby. They will apprehend you. Runaways are always caught by them. The patrols, the dogs, I would rather die. Georgia cotton harvesting is more of a struggle than a death. But because she inhaled, I'm telling you. Since you have been blogging about my mother's situation, even though you can't admit it, I believe you believe me when I tell you what actually happened." Protectively, Thomas closed his journal. "How did you find out?" "I listen, I see stuff. And even though your father isn't Master Thomas, I know you're a good person. I thus ask that you hold off on telling anyone that I'm gone for 3 days. Only 3 days. Allow me to travel to Charleston. They will accuse me of lying to you if they discover that I knew but chose not to inform. Stated that I was only planning to pay a visit to someone in the quarters. In the event that I deceived you, they will think that my overconfidence aided me. In his journal, Thomas gazed at the pages that contained his personal rebellion against the system he was expected to inherit. For her little chance of survival, Ruby was pleading with him to put those written misgivings into action and jeopardize his own comfort. After 3 days, he eventually muttered, "But where will you go, Ruby, even if you make it to Charleston? The Quakers could be helpful, but you're so young and there are slave catchers all around the city. I'll find a solution, I must." Ruby bundled her few belongings in a bundle of cloth that evening. A slice of dinner-time cornbread, an extra dress, and something she had concealed since her mother's passing. Years ago, a patient crafted a tiny wooden bird for her, all that remained of the woman whose murder she had seen. Before midnight, the house fell asleep. Ruby crept out of her tiny room, walked quietly into the dimly lit kitchen, and carefully opened the rear door. The symphony of frogs from the next creek filled the warm, humid spring air. Having worked in the kitchen for months, she had researched the route and knew which roads led to Charleston and which paths the patrols preferred. She might have made it 200 yards. Fled the home when she was abruptly stopped by a voice, when Dutch Calloway emerged from behind an outbuilding and exclaimed, "Going somewhere, girl." Ruby's heart fell. He had consumed alcohol. Even from 10 feet away, she could smell the whiskey, and there was a wickedness in his face that made her stomach knot. He said, "Thought you might try something," and stepped forward. "Been watching you, seeing that rebellious look in your eye just like your mama had right before she died." Ruby retreated, her thoughts whirling with impossibilities. She was 9 years old and confronting an adult man. She would flee and he would catch her, scream, and wake the house, or worse, fight. "You know what happened to your mama?" Calloway went on, his voice taking on a mocking tone fueled by drink. "Samuel believes that you forgot. You know because you saw. I believe you have learned to be silent. However, I've seen how you gaze at me. You recall everything," Ruby remarked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "The practiced falsehood comes naturally. Don't act foolish. Through the barn boards you were able to observe. Your eye caught mine." He stopped as if he realized he was confessing. "And I saw you standing there, while I protected myself from your mother's assault. Please, Mr. Calloway, I only wanted to check out the quarters. Quit talking." His hand sprang out, injuring her arm as it did so. Another voice said from the shadows, "You think I'm stupid? You think I'm going to let you run off to Charleston and tell your stories?" Thomas Rutledge said, "Let her go," held his father's hunting gun as he stepped out into the moonlight. Although the weapon was obviously too heavy for the trembling boy, he kept it aimed at Calloway. "Master Thomas," Calloway replied, adopting an air of coerced deference. "The girl was fleeing. I saw her merely carrying out my duties." "Let her go," I said. "Boy, you have no idea what you're doing. Your dad, the father did nothing to stop Ruby's mother's death." Thomas spoke quickly as though he had been suppressing the words for months. "I trust Ruby because she told me the truth. You've been under my observation, Mr. Calloway. I've witnessed the employees' terror of you. I've put everything in writing. All I have heard and seen." Anger darkened Calloway's face. "You have no understanding what you're discussing. With your father's approval, I had done what I had done. I kept things in order because he needed it. You had to kill someone for him. She assaulted me." Ruby was present. She witnessed everything. "Didn't my father also attend?" "Ruby told me that in the cellar. And that's what you fear others will discover." For a long time, the standoff persisted. Each of the 3 individuals, frozen in the moonlight of Carolina, knew that their destinies would be altered by what transpired next. At last, Calloway shoved Ruby's arm free, causing her to stumble. "Boy, you're doing something wrong. You and your father will lose everything as a result of this error," Thomas answered, his voice more steady now. "Perhaps. However, I will be able to live with myself at least." Ruby realized they had created an adversary who would never forget this moment, as Calloway stalked back toward his rooms. With a mixture of excitement and terror on his face, Thomas dropped the rifle, which had not even been loaded, and turned to face Ruby. "Now, before he wakes my father, you must leave," he continued. "Go to Charleston, find the Quakers like that man Winters mentioned. I'll tell them you slipped away while I was asleep. They'll come looking for you, but you'll have an advantage." Thomas remained silent for a moment, saying, "Because what happened to your mother was wrong." Because honorable men stand up for what's right. And then he showed me that he doesn't believe his own words. Because he struggled to articulate something beyond his years. Because if I don't help you, then I'm just as guilty as he is. Ruby wanted to thank him, to show her appreciation for a kindness she had never expected from the master's son. But there was no time. She fled into the night, leaving behind the only house she had ever known, with only a wooden bird and the memory of her mother's murder. Behind her, Thomas Rutledge went back to his room and frantically wrote in his journal, recording everything that had just happened, establishing a record that would eventually help reveal the truth. And in his quarters, Dutch Calloway drank excessively and planned retaliation against a boy who had chosen the wrong side, and a 9-year-old child who had seen too much. The events of that night would set off a series of events that would eventually result in the confession letter discovered in 1847. But Ruby's story was far from over. Ruby arrived in Charleston 3 days later, half-starved and exhausted, her feet bleeding from walking roads and cutting through swamps. The city overwhelmed her senses with the harbor smelling of salt and fish, the noise of merchants selling goods, and the press of humanity in numbers she had never imagined. She was a 9-year-old runaway in a city full of slave catchers and patrollers, and she had no idea how to find the Quaker meeting house on King Street. For 2 days, she hid in the alleys near the dock, stealing food scraps and sleeping in the shadows of warehouses. The darkest revelations about what had actually happened in the barn on August 14th, 1834 were yet to come. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, so she didn't dare approach enslaved people on errands for their masters. On the 3rd day, exhausted and desperate, she made a mistake and tried to steal bread from a market stall, but the merchant grabbed her arm before she could flee. "Got us a little thief here," he called out, and a crowd started to form. "Who's your master, girl? Where are you supposed to be?" Ruby's mind went blank with fear. Then a woman's voice broke through the crowd. "She belongs to my household. I've been looking everywhere for her. Thank you for catching her." The woman who stepped forward was maybe 40 years old, plainly dressed in gray, her steel-cold hair pulled back severely, her face unremarkable, but her eyes held intelligence and something else, determination. The merchant looked skeptical. Someone would identify her as a runaway, and she would be sent back to Magnolia Ridge, where punishments for attempted escape were harsh and public, meant to deter others from trying. "You sure she's yours? Got papers?" "She's been with my family since birth, and she's been troubled lately since losing her mother." The woman put more coins on the merchant's table than the bread was worth, and the merchant took the money and released Ruby's arm, guiding her away from the market through winding streets that Ruby couldn't follow. The woman's hand closed around Ruby's shoulder, firm but not painful, and she stopped them. When they finally arrived at the Society of Friends meeting house, a small building tucked away from the street, and only marked by a plain wooden sign, Ruby whispered, "How did you know?" "Know what? That you needed help?" The woman said grimly, "We see many who need help. My name is Sarah Peaton, and you, child, are going to tell me everything." Ruby finally broke down in a small room that smelled of old books and beeswax, and she told Sarah everything she had seen in the barn. Dutch Calloway's violence, Samuel Rutledge's complicity, the months of enforced silence, Thomas's unexpected help. The words poured out in a torrent. 9 months of suppressed truth, finally finding a listener who believed her. Sarah listened without interruption, her face getting grimmer with each detail. And after Ruby finished, the woman was silent for a long time. "They'll come looking for you here. Charleston isn't far enough. Even in the North, the Fugitive Slave Act means you could be caught and sent back." Sarah stood and paced the tiny room. "This is dangerous knowledge, I know. That's why they were going to sell me to Georgia. That's why they're coming here. Georgia. That's why they're coming here." When properly documented and protected, it could be powerful, especially when combined with other evidence. What other evidence? In February, Jacob Winters, a traveler who isn't really a journalist but works with us to document abuses for eventual publication, visited Magnolia Ridge. He suspected something wasn't right at that plantation, and your behavior confirmed it to him. Since then, he has been looking for a way to look into it further. You mean people might actually believe me? Some people? Not the ones who stand to gain from the system remaining exactly as it is, but some. The problem is keeping you safe long enough to tell your story properly. Sarah decided, "We'll send you north to Philadelphia. There are people there who can protect you and help get your testimony recorded. We need one more piece of evidence, though. But we need Thomas Rutledge's journal. Sarah's plan was dangerous, almost insane. She would use the network of sympathetic souls, both free and enslaved, that existed throughout the South despite all efforts to keep it that way, to send word to Thomas, who would then be asked to copy the pertinent pages from his journal and send them to Charleston via the same network. When combined with Ruby's testimony, the plantation owner's own son's written observations could offer strong proof of what had actually occurred. We have to try, Ruby. What happened to your mother happens too frequently in too many places and almost always without consequences. If we can document this one case, prove it. But what if they catch whoever is carrying the message? What if Master Thomas refuses? What if his father finds out? Then we proceed with only your testimony, which will be worth less without corroboration. Thomas's help in Ruby's escape had been discovered, and while Ruby waited in hiding in Philadelphia, staying with a Quaker family who had previously taken in fugitives, events at Magnolia Ridge were spiraling toward a violent confrontation. Dutch Calloway had woken Samuel Rutledge before dawn, explaining that the girl had run away and that Thomas had caught her but allowed her to escape, even threatening the overseer with a rifle to prevent recapture. Samuel's response was cold fury. That murder had been committed and covered up, but it might help. She was being sold to that man in Georgia, and she would die there. She would, and she didn't deserve any of this. Her mother attacked my overseer. That's a lie. He had called Thomas to his study and demanded an explanation. The boy backed into a corner and, suddenly realizing the full weight of what he'd done, had defended his actions with all the moral certainty of youth. It was the first time Samuel Rutledge had ever hit his child, and the slap came hard and fast, Samuel's hand hitting his son's face with enough force to knock the boy off his chair. Thomas's voice broke with emotion, and Ruby told me what actually happened. She saw it all. You were there, Father. You could have stopped it and you didn't. You chose to let Mr. Calloway kill her. Thomas, bleeding from his lip, looked up at his father with eyes that had lost something essential. She didn't lie. I know she told lies. You will never say those words again, Samuel said, his voice trembling with anger and something else. Fear. An enslaved girl told you lies. And you believed her over your own father, over Dutch Calloway, over the magistrate who looked into it and found it lawful. Thomas got up, disregarding the consequences. I've written it all down, Father. Everything I've seen, everything Ruby told me, everything that's wrong with this place. I have pages and pages of documentation. I didn't. How could you possibly know that? Because I've been watching. I've seen how Mr. Calloway treats people. I've seen the fear. I've seen how you pretend not to notice. Recording it. Samuel's face turned pale. Where is this journal? Somewhere you'll never find it. The ensuing abuse was severe. Samuel, filled with anger and fear over the potential consequences of his son's writings for his reputation and legal status, went beyond a limit he had never experienced before. Margaret attempted to step in but was pushed away. The violence only ceased when Samuel's sister put herself in the way of the father and son, yelling that he would kill the boy if he didn't stop. Dutch Calloway provided a solution. Thomas was confined to his room, which was thoroughly searched for the journal, but they were unable to find it, because Thomas had concealed it well inside a loose floorboard beneath his bed, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. However, the search did turn up something else: the card Jacob Winters had given him with the Charleston address. Samuel now realized the full extent of the threat. His son had documented evidence of murder and cover-up, had been in contact with abolitionists, and was possibly preparing to testify against his own father. I know a military academy in Virginia that specializes in correcting young men with rebellious attitudes. But before those plans could be put into action, the message from Sarah Peaton arrived, carried by a free black man who worked as a carter and traveled regularly between Charleston and rural plantations. The message was coded, but Thomas understood it. Ruby was safe and she was asking for his help. That Winters fellow and the runaway girl poisoned the boy against you. She wanted copies of his journal entries about the night the patients died. Thomas had to decide whether to follow his father's wishes, destroy his journal, and accept that injustice was just the way things were, or fully embrace the rebellion he had begun, even though it meant losing everything he had ever known. Thomas chose rebellion, and over the course of 3 nights of candlelight, he copied 23 pages from his journal, covering everything from the night Ruby came screaming into the house to his encounter with Dutch Calloway during Ruby's escape attempt. His handwriting, still developing and childish, nevertheless captured truths that adults had tried hard to hide. Using a hairpin he had stolen from his aunt's room to pick the simple lock, he sneaked out of his still-locked room on the fourth night and met the Carter at a pre-arranged spot close to the edge of the property. He whispered a message to be delivered to Ruby and handed over the canvas-wrapped copies of the pages. "Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't do more. Tell her I think she's real." Knowing that what he had just done was irrevocable, Thomas went back to his room as the Carter vanished into the night. There would be repercussions, possibly serious ones, but he had already made up his mind. Thomas was unaware that Dutch Calloway had been keeping an eye on the house because he had suspicions. The overseer grinned cruelly as he watched Thomas greet the Carter and watch the bundle change hands. The child had just shown proof of an abolitionist conspiracy. Calloway used it as justification to persuade Samuel Rutledge that more harsh action was necessary. Early the following morning, Thomas was awakened by his father and two other men who had recruited muscle from Charleston. After searching his room, they discovered the journal tucked away under the floorboards. With a face like carved stone, Samuel read the entries. When he was done, he turned to face his son with a calculating, unloving gaze. "Your nation, your class, and your family have all been betrayed by you. I was honest. You are guilty of treason." Samuel gave Dutch Calloway the journal. "Burn it, everything." "No." The hired men quickly stopped Thomas as he grabbed for the journal. The journal was taken by Calloway. Outside, they could hear the crackling of flames as months of meticulous paperwork by Thomas burned to the ground. However, the overseer had committed a crucial mistake. The pages that Thomas had sent to Charleston were the ones that survived. 2 weeks later, Ruby would receive them in Philadelphia, where they would finally be included in the confession letter discovered in 1847. Just when we believed we had seen everything. Charleston's horror grows more intense. Share this video with a buddy who likes dark mysteries if this narrative is making you shiver. To show your support for our content, click the like button. Additionally, remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. Together, let's find out what occurs next. The following week, Thomas Rutledge was transferred to Virginia's Braxton Military Academy, a brutal school that was notorious for crushing the spirits of disobedient young men. His father wished that his son's harmful sympathies would be erased by the academy, and that he would become a good Southern gentleman. With Ruby and Thomas gone, Dutch Calloway's reign grew even more ruthless at Magnolia Ridge. The overseer felt free to act on his darkest inclinations, since the master's son was not present to see or record abuses. That summer, 2 more slaves perished under strange circumstances. Samuel Rutledge, driven by panic over what testimony could be flowing in abolitionist circles, sank progressively into drink and seclusion. Observing her brother's decline and recalling the violence she had seen between Samuel and Thomas, Margaret Rutledge started to doubt her own involvement in the incidents that had ruined their family. She began keeping a private journal in which she wrote about her uncertainties, her feelings of guilt, and her developing understanding that the system she had defended throughout her life was inherently evil. The Quaker family that was providing Ruby with sanctuary in Philadelphia was teaching her how to read and write correctly. Although she was getting treatment for the trauma she had experienced, she was having dreams about she was still awakened by the Barnes cries. She sobbed when she saw Thomas's childish handwriting on the pages he had copied, which confirmed her story. Evidence that a member of the realm of masters had put truth before expediency. Together with other abolitionists, Sarah Peaton and Jacob Winters started gathering information concerning Magnolia Ridge, including Ruby's testimony, passages from Thomas's journal and other sources, and compiled it into a document that they hoped would be published or used in court. However, they misjudged Dutch Calloway's will to defend himself. Throughout South Carolina, the overseer maintained relationships with slave catchers who hunted for fugitives for a living. He announced that a Ruby Drummond was a dangerous liar who spread lies about respectable white men, and a sizable reward was offered for her return. Even people who might usually turn away were tempted by the size of the incentive. One of these slave collectors, Silas Crenshaw, learned in September 1835 that a young black girl who fit Ruby's description was living in Philadelphia with Quakers. He was legally permitted to operate in northern states by the Fugitive Slave Act. Furthermore, Crenshaw was proficient in his cruel trade, even with the Quaker's best efforts to protect him. On a Tuesday evening, he broke into the Quaker home with 2 fake documents and came for Ruby. Hired thugs. Although they were pacifists and had never planned for violence, the family made an effort to resist. After being shackled and hauled from her bed, Ruby was placed in a wagon and driven back to South Carolina. The journey back took 6 days. Gaggling and afraid, Ruby realized she was being brought back to face a penalty that would probably result in her death. She had threatened to reveal a murder, humiliated Samuel Rutledge, and ruined his connection with his son. No mercy would be shown. However, Crenshaw erred. He decided on a path that went via Virginia and spent the night in a Richmond pub. Locked in the wagon, Ruby worked her hands free from the ropes while the slave catcher drank inside. She dashed into the Richmond night after kicking at the back gate of the cart until it cracked. She wandered inside the Braxton Military Academy grounds by accident or fate. The Military Academy's main building, a harsh brick facility that resembled a prison more than a school, was situated on 20 acres of Virginia woodland. A groom discovered Ruby the following morning after she had slumped close to the stables, bleeding from her escape and dazed with terror. 10-year-old Thomas Rutledge and was working stable duty as a form of discipline for disobedience after 6 months at Braxton, when the groom took the unconscious girl to the hospital. He knew her right away. Ruby. In order to kneel next to the cot where the academy nurse was lying, he pushed past her. "What happened, Ruby?" She momentarily couldn't believe she was seeing him as she woke up to his voice. "How are you doing, Master Thomas? After I presented your story to the abolitionists, my father sent me here." "Why are you in Virginia, Ruby?" Philadelphia was meant to be a safe place. Ruby described the slave catcher, the capture, and the escape through teary eyes and chapped lips. "They are on their way to me. When he realizes I'm gone, that man, Crenshaw, will start looking everywhere. I am unable to. There's nowhere else for me to run." Thomas had a determined expression on his face. "Then we don't run. We defend ourselves. We tell everyone the truth, and we utilize my position to force them to pay attention. I won't be believed by them." Slaves are never believed by them. With my father's influence, perhaps not in South Carolina, but here, it's Virginia. Additionally, this academy's commandant is a veteran of the Union Army who dislikes plantation owners. He has said some critical things about the system that I have heard. You should give it a shot. Despite Ruby's objections, Thomas went straight to Marcus Wellesley, a 53-year-old sharpshooter who oversaw Braxton Academy with military accuracy. After knocking on the door of the common dancing office, Thomas spoke with all the bravery he had built up over the previous grueling months. "A runaway slave girl is in our hospital, sir. On my father's property, she saw a murder. Her name is Ruby Drummond. I personally recorded and forwarded the murder testimony to Philadelphia abolitionists, and I have documentation of it. Silas Crenshaw, a slave collector, is pursuing her with the goal of taking her back to South Carolina, where her testimony will probably be prevented by her death. I am aware, sir, that the law favors the slave catcher, but she has the moral right. I beg you to keep her safe." Wellesley watched the youngster in front of him. Wellesley had seen something different from Thomas Rutledge, who had come to Braxton 6 months prior with a reputation for causing problems. A young man whose values had caused him to clash with his father. The commoner was dubious of the South's assertions of benevolent slavery because he had witnessed enough brutality and injustice while serving in the military. During the War of 1812, I'm being asked to violate the Fugitive Slave Act. "Sir, I'm pleading with you to stop a murder." Wellesley made a choice that would change the course of many lives. "Please provide the paperwork you mentioned. Let me see what proof you have." Thomas had something better, but he didn't have the original journal because it was destroyed. He had committed a lot of it to memory, and over the course of the following 3 hours, he reenacted important sections for Commandant Wellesley, detailing in great detail what Ruby had seen, what he had seen at Magnolia Ridge, and the conspiracy of silence that had shielded the guilty. When Ruby was well enough to testify, she described the night in the barn with such detail that no uncertainty about her sincerity. The following day, when Silas Crenshaw showed up at the academy with his fake documents and legal right to take back his property, he encountered opposition rather than assistance. Supported by 6 armed academy instructors, Commandant Wellesley refused to hand Ruby over. "Mr. Crenshaw, I think this child is a material witness to a murder, but your paperwork might be in order. I'm holding her while Virginia authorities conduct an investigation. If you don't agree, you can petition the Richmond court. The slave catcher left empty-handed, but he promised to return with court orders and legal muscle. Over the next few weeks, Commandant Wellesley used his military connections to draw attention to Ruby's case, contacting Union Army officers who sympathized with abolitionists, writing to newspapers in Richmond and Washington, and making sure that Ruby's testimony and Thomas's corroborated account were recorded by multiple witnesses. The pressure from Creenaw's sputtering about the law, property rights, and the trouble he'd cause at Braxton Academy forced Virginia authorities to open an investigation into the events at Magnolia Ridge. I knew the official account didn't align with what I'd observed of Patient's character. I knew Ruby's initial testimony was damning. The cursory 1834 ruling was examined and found wanting. New testimony was taken from enslaved workers at Magnolia Ridge who, sensing possible protection from Virginia investigators, began speaking more openly about Dutch Calloway's brutality and Samuel Rutledge's complicity. Margaret Rutledge was called to testify and shocked everyone by producing her own journal, in which she detailed her growing doubts about what had happened to Patience Drummond, a conversation she'd overheard between her brother and the overseer, and her own complicity in maintaining the false narrative. The investigation uncovered more facts about Magnolia Ridge, including the fact that Samuel Rutledge had been deeply in debt and desperate to keep his plantation productive at all costs. That correspondence between Rutledge and Dutch Calloway documented a pattern of increasing violence with the overseer, essentially, given free rein to control the enslaved workforce by whatever means he deemed necessary, and that the pitchfork that had allegedly been used to attack Calloway showed no signs of violence. Accusations should have been investigated rather than suppressed, but I chose to protect my brother and preserve our social standing, which led to my complicity in covering up her murder. Clarara's observation to Ruby years earlier was confirmed. The pitchfork had been placed near the patient's right hand, but she had been left-handed. This small detail, however, revealed the hasty staging of a crime scene. Dutch Calloway, sensing the investigation closing in, tried to flee South Carolina, making it as far as Alabama before being caught by federal marshals. There was no blood or tissue to confirm that she had used it as a weapon. The blood pattern on the barn floor suggested a one-sided beating rather than a mutual struggle. In February 1836, Ruby Drummond and Thomas Rutledge sat together in a Richmond courthouse and gave formal testimony about what had happened on August 14, 1834. Ruby, now 10 years old, spoke clearly about witnessing her mother's murder, and Thomas, also 10, confirmed her account and provided context about the plantation's atmosphere of violence and fear. The legal proceedings were complicated by jurisdictional issues and the fact that the crime had occurred in South Carolina, where local authorities were still inclined to protect Samuel Rutledge. However, the publicity generated by the case, which was heightened by abolitionist newspapers in the North, created pressure that Dutch Calloway was ultimately tried for manslaughter rather than murder, a compromise verdict that no one was satisfied with, but was thought to be the best possible outcome. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison, of which he served 4 before passing away from pneumonia in a Georgia prison. Samuel Rutledge never faced criminal charges, but the social repercussions were severe. His reputation was destroyed, his debts were overwhelming, and his health was shattered. He sold Magnolia Ridge in 1837 and died 2 years later a broken man. A small act of atonement for years of complicity, but one that Ruby accepted with complicated gratitude. Margaret Rutledge used a portion of the proceeds from the plantation sale to purchase Ruby's freedom, legally manumitting her in a document filed with the Charleston court. Thomas Rutledge, who had finished his education at Braxton Academy and later attended a university in Pennsylvania, where he became involved in the abolitionist movement, and Ruby kept up a correspondence for years. 2 individuals whose childhood trauma had unexpectedly bound them together. However, the story's last chapter described how the confession letter was discovered in the walls of the demolished Plantation Manor in 1847. In 1846, Ruby Drummond, a 20-year-old free woman living in Philadelphia, learned that Magnolia Ridge was being demolished. The plantation had changed hands twice since Samuel Rutledge's death, and the current owner was renovating the manor house to build a more modern structure. Ruby traveled to South Carolina for the first time since fleeing 12 years earlier. bringing with her a comprehensive account of her mother's murder. By combining her testimony, excerpts from Thomas's journal and Margaret Rutledge's confessional, The True Account of Patience Drummond's Death was the title she gave it. She met Thomas, a 21-year-old law student, visiting the Magnolia Ridge ruins. They stood together in front of the barn where it all started, which was now deteriorated and slated to be demolished. "Let's leave a record," Thomas suggested, "something that is difficult to dismiss or destroy. Even when the lawsuits are over, the truth should be kept intact." They wrote what would be referred to as the Letter of Confession. Before Thomas's boyhood journal extracts in his surviving juvenile calligraphy, Ruby's testimony in her adult handwriting is shown. One truth, two voices, and two viewpoints. In the hopes that it might one day be discovered and taken seriously, they concealed the paper behind the manor's wall while it was being demolished and sealed it in oilcloth. Similar to how officials had attempted to suppress the original testimony, the Charleston Historical Society first attempted to suppress it when workers found it in 1847. However, copies had been produced and the tale circulated around abolitionist networks, adding to the mounting national debate over the inherent evil of slavery. The life of Ruby Drummond would see the abolition of slavery during the Civil War, passing away in 1891 at the age of 65, while surrounded by the children and grandchildren her mother never met. Thomas Rutledge spent his professional life attempting to atone for his father's transgressions by becoming a lawyer who focused on defending former slaves in court. In 1848, the barn where Patience passed away was demolished. According to local folklore, the earth there never produced anything healthy again. However, this is probably just bad soil. As a kind of penance, Margaret Rutledge spent her last years running a school in Charleston for black children who had been emancipated. This conundrum demonstrates that the truth can endure even when it is suppressed by authority and shielded by the law. Patience. Under the 1834 system, Drummond's murder was permissible. However, it was never fair. What are your thoughts of this narrative? Are there still mysteries in South Carolina, or do you think everything was made public? Get out of here, leave a comment below. Please subscribe and click the notification bell if you like this story and would like to see more horror tales like it, and tell someone who enjoys mysteries about it. History's darkest periods should be remembered, not forgotten. I'll see you in the upcoming video.